Hey all, I know this is a bit different, um, because I'm on my laptop, so it's very different from you know how it was when I was on my phone. The camera quality is not the one, but we do what we have to do. Today's video is something that I briefly talked about in my last video, and I talked about salvation. Now I want to clarify something, and that's the point of this video. And I'm going to talk about salvation versus being saved. Because salvation and being saved are two different things. And I know I used them interchangeably in my last video. I talked about salvation, but I didn't specify that I was talking about being saved. But honestly, I genuinely think that the last video also applies to being saved as well because, locking down or locking in with Jesus, is something that you would do on the process or on the path of salvation. So let's talk about it. To start, I'm going to read a scripture, Philippians 2:12. Therefore, my dear friends, as you have always obeyed, not only in my presence, but now much more in my absence, continue to work out your salvation with fear and trembling. Now, this is definitely one of the most misunderstood Bible verses, and I say this from a place of personal experience because I remember when I first read this scripture, I remember like the way I felt when I read it. I was like, this seems wrong, like I was conflicted because I knew that this, if it was indeed saying this in the manner in which I understood it, that it would contradict the rest of Scripture, and I knew that was impossible, obviously, because Scripture is completely perfect. It's coherent. There's no contradictions. So basically, it sounded like Paul was saying like you need to work to be saved, but obviously I knew that wasn't true, because if you look at Romans and practically like all the books that Paul wrote in the New Testament, and just the New Testament in general, he just goes on and on about the grace of God all over. And especially like in the book of Romans with Paul, he just does he's hammering down the concept of grace constantly. And then Paul again in Ephesians, very popular verse, Ephesians 2 verse 8 to 9, it says, "For it is by his grace that we have been saved." I'm paraphrasing, but it says, "For it is by grace you have been saved through faith, and this is not from yourselves, it is the gift of God." And then in verse 9 it says, "Not by works, so that no one can boast." So he's like very specific. So I'm like, this can't be the same dude. It doesn't even make sense. And even if it is different dudes, it just contradicts the rest of Scripture. But I know that's not possible. So I'm there confused. I'm confused. And I'm like, I asked God to help me. I asked God to help me understand. And it took some time. In fact, it took years for me to finally understand it. It took years, I think 1 or 2 years. Because what would happen is that even though I was constantly meditating on it, and that is to say, I was constantly thinking about the scripture, I would gloss over it whenever I was studying the scriptures because, I was like, I don't get this yet. I'm just going to trust God. And so when the Lord revealed to me, and this is crazy because it's just like a grammar thing, that Paul, by the Spirit, never said to work for your salvation, it really hit me. So let's go back. Philippians 2:12. Therefore, my dear friends, as you have always obeyed, not only in my presence, but now much more in my absence, continue to work out your salvation with fear and trembling. Notice he didn't say work for your salvation. So these are two different things. It's often grammatical. It's weird that that's what tripped me up grammar, but so the Lord reveals to me that he never said to work for your salvation, and there's a huge difference. And I feel like the biggest revelation that the Lord hit me with was when he helped me to understand that there is a difference between salvation and being saved. So I think that like the main issue is that there needed to be an understanding that there is a difference between being saved initially and our ongoing salvation. So being saved, you know, is just giving your life to Christ. That is Romans, and even that is kind of part of salvation, but it's just that moment when, that we see in Romans 10, verse 9. If you declare with your mouth, Jesus is Lord, and I believe, and you believe in your heart that God raised him from the dead, you will be saved. So that's, you notice that he says you will be saved. And then again in Ephesians 2, verse 8 to 9, being saved is just the beginning of salvation. Salvation is an ongoing process, and the end goal is that we become the mature bride that Jesus is coming for. The end goal is being completely transformed into the image of his son, and that we see that in 2 Corinthians 3 verse 18, which reads, "And we all who with unveiled faces contemplate the Lord's glory are being transformed into his image." You see that? Into his image with ever increasing glory, which comes from the Lord, who is the Spirit. And not to go off track, but like look at the smooth connection with Romans 12 verse 2, which talks about not conforming your mind to the pattern of this world, but being transformed by the renewing of your mind. And you see that we all with an open face contemplate the Lord's glory and therefore are being transformed into his image. But I'm going off track. The point is that you can see that that is the end goal of salvation, and that is the process of salvation. And this is what Paul is talking about in Philippians 2. Like, again, if you look at Romans 5 verse 10, and this is why I highlighted Romans in the beginning, because Romans really just hammers this point in. But Romans 5 verse 10, "For if when we were enemies we were reconciled to God by the death of his son, much more being reconciled we shall be saved by his life." So you got to ask yourself, like, what does being saved by his life mean? The death of his son is pretty much straightforward. It's just, giving your life to Christ. You say the prayer of salvation. And that's just what being saved by the death of his son does. It's very straightforward. But being saved by his life, that refers to the ongoing process of salvation, and that is the being daily transformed into the image of Jesus, where we in our journey of salvation become more and more like Jesus. And because this ongoing sanctification does not happen unless you have his life in you, it's pretty clear that it's talking about people who are already saved, and yet it uses the word salvation. So that's why there is that distinction there. So this is what helped me understand Philippians 2:12, is to show me that we are not working for our salvation, or rather to be saved, but we are working out our salvation, which is the being daily transformed, which is the renewing of the mind, which is becoming more and more like Jesus every single day. And there is a third layer to this, but like for now, I'll stop here since this is the focus of the video. God bless my friends. From your friendly neighborhood believer. Signing off. I would throw in a Spider-Man quip, but I don't have one on hand at the moment, so God bless.